The wheelchair hit the wall so hard, the frame cracked. Glass exploded across marble floor. A silver tray clattered into the fireplace. And in the middle of the wreckage, a man who once made grown syndicate leaders beg for their lives sat shaking, fists clenched, screaming at a woman who refused to run. "Get out!" She didn't move. He grabbed the nearest object, a porcelain vase, worth more than most people's cars, and hurled it at the wall beside her head. It shattered inches from her face. She didn't flinch. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 10, and then something in him broke completely. His shoulders collapsed. His breath came in ragged, broken pulls. The most feared man in the Korean underworld, the man who once promised his wife, "I'll protect both of you," folded forward in his wheelchair and wept like a man drowning in his own skin. "I killed them," he choked out. "I killed them. I should have listened. I should have listened." Zariah Ellison crossed the broken glass without looking down once. She knelt in front of him, ignored the shards biting into her scrubs, and pulled him into her arms. "You don't have to carry them alone anymore." 22 nurses had walked through that door before her. Every single one of them ran. She was the one who stayed. If you want to know how a woman with nothing but patience and stubborn Southern grit brought a Korean Mafia boss back from the edge of himself, stay with me till the end, because this story is about to break your heart before it puts it back together. Don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a like before we go back to where it all began. You're going to want to be here for what happens next. 3 years earlier, Kang Tae-hyun had been a man the world feared and respected in equal measure. 3 years later, he was a man his own household staff had learned to survive rather than serve. The accident had been engineered to look like fate. A brake line, a mountain road outside Seattle, a rainstorm that gave the story its plausible deniability. The truth was colder. A rival syndicate, the Choi Line, had waited 18 months for the right moment to remind Kang Tae-hyun that power always came with a price tag someone else could set. His wife, Yoon So-jin, had begged him that morning not to make the trip. "I have a bad feeling," she'd whispered, her hand flat against his chest. "Please, can we leave tomorrow instead?" He'd kissed her forehead, the way he always did, like she was something breakable he'd been trusted to hold. "I'll protect both of you." 6-year-old Ha-hyun had been asleep in her car seat when the brakes failed on the descent. Seo-jin had been reaching back to check on her. Tae-hyun had been the one driving. He was also the only one who survived. The spinal damage took his legs. The guilt took everything else. For 3 years, he ran through nurses the way other men ran through cigarettes. 22 of them, each one lasting anywhere from 4 days to 6 weeks. One had quit after he threw a bowl of soup at her, simply for asking if he'd slept. Another left a resignation letter that consisted of exactly one line. "I did not train for this job to be told, 'I hope I die in my sleep every night.'" The household staff had taken to keeping a betting pool on how long each new hire would last. Nobody had ever guessed longer than 60 days. Nobody had ever been right. He didn't skip physical therapy because he thought it wouldn't work. He skipped it because some nights, when the pain in his legs matched the pain in his chest, it felt like the only honest math left in his life. He refused medication for the same reason a man refuses a blanket in the snow. Comfort felt like theft. Comfort felt like something he had no right to take from a world that had let his daughter die in the back seat of his own car. His household staff had a name for the estate now, though none of them said it to his face: the mausoleum. The household staff had started a betting pool on how long each new hire would last. Grace, the head housekeeper, kept the ledger in a kitchen drawer, and the current record, 31 days, set by a nurse who'd once served in an actual war zone, was treated with the reverence of an Olympic record. The most recent entry belonged to a nurse named Priya, who had lasted exactly 6 hours before storming out with her coat still half-buttoned. "He asked me," she'd announced to the kitchen staff on her way out the door, "if I was going to cry about it. I said no. Then I cried about it in my car for 20 minutes, and I want that on the record." Grace had dutifully written it down. 6 hours, cried in car. Still counts. Even the staff who'd stopped believing anyone could reach him found it difficult not to laugh, quietly, guiltily, at the sheer theatre of it. A man so committed to being unbearable that he'd turned his own misery into the household's only reliable form of entertainment. Everyone had accepted the same conclusion, quietly, individually, over 3 years. Kang Tae-hyun could not be saved. He didn't want to be. And then, on a grey Tuesday morning that meant nothing to anyone else on earth, Zariah Ellison walked through the front gate with a duffel bag over one shoulder and an expression that suggested she'd already heard every rumor about this house and found none of them particularly interesting. She was 31, from Savannah, Georgia, with 12 years of trauma nursing behind her and a reputation for staying with patients other agencies had quietly written off. Madam Han, the household's longtime manager, met her at the door with the same tight, practiced smile she gave every new hire, the smile of someone who had already started the countdown clock in her head. "You'll want to know where the exits are," Madam Han said, not unkindly. "Most of them ask by the second day." "I'll figure it out," Zariah said. "I usually do." Madam Han studied her a moment longer than the smile suggested she wanted to. She'd delivered this same welcome 22 times, and every time, some part of her hoped, against her better judgment, that this would be the one who stayed. Every time, she'd made herself stop hoping by the second week. It hurt less that way. 30 days, she said finally. "That is how long I will hold his advisors off from replacing you if things go badly. After that, it is out of my hands." Why 30? Because that is how long it usually takes for someone to admit they were wrong about him. A pause. In either direction. Zariah didn't ask what that meant. She'd find out on her own, the way she always did. She was shown to a small guest suite on the east wing and given exactly 4 minutes to unpack before Madam Han knocked again. "He knows you've arrived," Madam Han said. "He asked me to tell you not to bother introducing yourself. He said it saves time." That's considerate of him. That is not the word most people use. Tae-hyun didn't bother looking up when she entered his study that afternoon. He was parked by the window, a glass of untouched water on the table beside him, his jaw set in the particular way of a man rehearsing his own cruelty before he'd even said a word. "Let me guess," he said. "Trauma nurse, 12 years experience, comes highly recommended, thinks she's different." "I don't think anything yet," Zariah said, setting her bag down. "I just got here. They all say that. Then I guess I'm predictable." She started unpacking his medication onto the tray, unbothered. "You want to throw something at me now, or should I finish setting up first? I'd rather not have to pick vitamins up off the floor twice." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Then, without warning, he picked up the water glass and threw it at the wall 3 feet from her head. She didn't so much as blink. She crouched, picked up the shards methodically, dropped them in the wastebasket, and kept arranging the tray. "You'll quit," he said. "They all do, usually faster than this." "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, and walked out. She did see him tomorrow, and the day after that, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, he'd escalated from throwing things to something crueler and quieter. Silence engineered to make her feel invisible. Meals refused, specifically when she was the one holding the tray. Medication, accidentally, knocked to the floor twice in one afternoon. "You're testing to see how much I can absorb before I break," she said on the 7th day, kneeling to pick up scattered pills for the second time that hour. "I should tell you, I used to work pediatric oncology. I've absorbed considerably worse than a grown man knocking pills off a tray." "Is that supposed to impress me?" "It's supposed to tell you this particular strategy isn't going to work, so you might want to save your energy for a better one." She set the tray back down, calm as ever. Also, for what it's worth, the pediatric patients were nicer about it. They at least apologized after. That got the faintest flicker of something across his face. Not quite a smile, but its distant, suspicious cousin. "I don't apologize," he said. "Yet," she said, and walked out before he could argue the point. 2 weeks in, she noticed something the staff had apparently stopped noticing. Nobody talked about who Kang Tae-hyun had been before the crash. Every story started at the accident, like the man had been born in that wreck, fully formed and fully furious. She found that strange for a man who clearly used to have a whole life attached to him. So she started asking questions the way she always did, patiently, sideways, without making it feel like an interrogation. It took her a week to track down Han Dae-sik, the bodyguard who'd protected Tae-hyun for 15 years, before resigning 6 months after the crash. He agreed to meet her at a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and old rain, and he studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "You're the new one," he said. "It wasn't a question. I'm the current one," she corrected. "Ask me again in a month." That got something close to a smile out of him. "I couldn't watch him disappear," he admitted, turning his cup slowly on the table. 15 years, I protected that man, and I couldn't protect him from the one thing that actually killed him. He's not dead. Parts of him are. Dae-sik leaned back. "You should know. Before the crash, he made breakfast every Sunday. Badly. Burned it more often than not. His daughter used to critique his pancakes like a food critic. 4 years old, absolutely brutal about it. Too flat, Appa. Try again." And he tried again. Every Sunday, for years, because a 4-year-old told him his pancakes lacked ambition. Despite herself, Zariah laughed, short, surprised. Dae-sik's mouth twitched upward, the first real crack in his composure since she'd sat down. "He kept every drawing she ever made him," he went on, "filed by date, if you can believe it. A man who once settled a territory dispute between 3 rival bosses in one afternoon, alphabetizing crayon drawings of stick-figure dogs. He never missed a recital, a birthday, a doctor's appointment. He was the kind of feared that made men twice his size cross the street to avoid him, and the kind of soft that made him get down on the floor to play tea party in a full suit before a business dinner, because Ha-eun told him the meeting could wait." Zariah said nothing. She let him keep going, watching something in his face soften and harden at once. A man handling a memory he wasn't sure he had permission to enjoy. "People think the wheelchair is his punishment," Dae-sik said finally. "It isn't. He doesn't think the wheelchair is his punishment. He thinks surviving is." The words landed in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "There's something else," Dae-sik added, quieter now. "The men who did this, they were never caught, and I don't think they've stopped watching this house." For the first time since she'd taken the case, Zariah felt something colder than sympathy settle into her spine. She didn't argue with him after that day. She stopped trying to convince him therapy would help, stopped lecturing him about medication, stopped treating his anger like a problem to be solved head-on. Instead, she started treating the man underneath it like someone worth being patient for. She wheeled him out to the garden his wife had designed, a space the staff avoided out of unspoken respect, or fear, or both. Some mornings they said nothing at all. Some mornings, she narrated the flowers, like a woman reading a stranger, a bedtime story he hadn't asked for. "That one," she said one morning, pointing to a cluster of white peonies, "looks like it's judging you. Everything in this garden judges me. Fair, but that one's judging you specifically." She grinned. "I can tell. Flower body language." He didn't laugh, but something in his jaw loosened, just slightly, and for Zariah, that counted as a win worth logging. When he refused to work his legs during physical therapy, she stopped mentioning physical therapy altogether. Instead, she challenged him to wheelchair races down the long marble hallway, insisting the winner got to pick dinner for a week. "This is undignified," he informed her, gripping the wheels. "This is cardio," she said. "Ready? Go." She let him win the first time. Barely. He rolled across the finish line half a length ahead of her, breathing hard, arms burning, and for one unguarded second, Something close to a smile ghosted across his face before he caught himself and smoothed it away. Almost. She saw it anyway. "You let me win," he said, once his breathing evened out. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Zariah, fine. Maybe a little. You looked like you needed it. I don't need pity victories." "Good, because that wasn't pity. That was strategy. I'm establishing a false sense of security before I destroy you next week." She grinned. "Rematch. Wednesday. And this time I'm not being nice." She wasn't. The following Wednesday, she beat him by a full 2 lengths, and the sound he made, somewhere between outrage and genuine, startled laughter, was the first sound she'd heard out of him that wasn't shaped by grief in any direction. "That was not fair," he said, still catching his breath. "That was cardio," she said sweetly. "You're welcome." At night, when the nightmares came, and they always came, she stopped bringing sleeping pills first. She brought tea instead, sat in the chair across from his bed, and let silence do what medicine couldn't. "You don't have to talk," she told him one night, when his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "I know. I'm not going anywhere, either way." He looked at her, like that sentence had cost her something he didn't understand yet. In a way, it had. There were smaller victories too, the kind that wouldn't make it into any medical chart, but mattered more than most of the ones that would. The evening he let the kitchen staff serve him kimchi jjigae instead of the bland, joyless meals he'd survived on for years, and made a face so dramatically offended by its spice level that Grace nearly dropped a serving tray laughing. The morning he corrected Zariah's attempt at Korean, badly translated from a phrase app, with such theatrical horror. "Please. Never say that again. To anyone. Ever." That she'd laughed so hard she'd had to sit down. "I'm trying," she protested. "You are endangering diplomatic relations between our countries. It can't be that bad. You just told me my chair smells like ambition." He shook his head gravely. "I don't know what that means. I don't think you know what that means." It became, without either of them naming it, a kind of ritual. Her badly mangled Korean, his increasingly theatrical outrage, both of them pretending the laughing fits that followed were about the words and not about how long it had been since either of them had laughed at all. The staff noticed the change before Tae-hyun did. 1 full meal eaten without incident. A photograph of his family finally allowed back onto the mantel, face out instead of turned to the wall. A laugh, genuine, startled out of him during one of the wheelchair races, that made even Madame Han pause mid-step in the hallway and stare like she'd witnessed a ghost learning to breathe again. But not everyone in that house was rooting for the Thor. "You are getting close to him," Madame Han said one evening, finding Zariah in the kitchen well past midnight. "It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a compliment. I'm doing my job. Your job is to keep him alive and comfortable. It is not to become someone he cannot function without." Madame Han's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Grief, dressed up as procedure. "I loved his wife. I held his daughter the week she was born. I have watched this family broken once already. I will not watch it happen again, because a nurse got too attached to play house with a man who has nothing left to lose. That's not what this is. I hope you're right." Madame Han's eyes didn't soften. "You have 18 days left." Zariah didn't sleep well that night, not because of the deadline, because some small, unguarded part of her was starting to suspect Madame Han wasn't entirely wrong to worry. Day 30 arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday, and nobody mentioned it out loud. Madame Han didn't come to Zariah's door with a suitcase or a replacement nurse trailing behind her. Instead, she left a small pot of tea outside Zariah's room that morning with a note that said only, "You may stay as long as he needs you," which, I suspect, will be longer than either of us expected. Zariah found Tae-hyun in the garden that evening, later than usual, staring at the sky like he was working up to saying something. "Do you know what today was?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his. "Should I?" Day 30, Madame Han's deadline, the day she was supposed to decide whether I stayed or got replaced. He turned to look at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. And she left tea outside my door, instead of a suitcase. Zariah smiled faintly. I think that's her version of admitting she was wrong. She doesn't admit things easily. Neither do you. No, he agreed, quiet. I don't. He was silent for a long moment, hands folded in his lap, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something more careful than his usual clipped precision. Can I ask you something? Always. Why did you really stay? 22 people didn't. You could have been the 23rd within the first week. Nobody would have blamed you. She considered the question honestly, the way she owed him after everything. Because the first day, when you threw that glass at me, you didn't actually aim to hit me. You aimed to miss, and you aimed to miss by exactly enough to scare me without hurting me. 22 nurses ran from a man throwing things. I stayed because I noticed the man underneath the anger was trying very hard not to actually harm anyone, including himself, even while convinced he deserved to. He didn't say anything for a long time. Nobody's noticed that before, he finally said. Not even me. That's usually how it works, she said gently. The people closest to their own pain are the last ones to see it clearly. The first sign that something outside the estate walls was watching came on an ordinary Thursday. Zariah noticed the same black sedan, parked across the street, 2 nights in a row, engine idling, no plates visible from her angle. The third night, it was gone before she could get a clear look. She mentioned it to Tae-hyun in passing, expecting him to wave it off. He didn't. His face went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math he didn't want to say out loud. Has anyone been asking about your schedule? He asked. Kitchen staff? Drivers? Anyone outside the house? Why would they? Just answer the question. She hesitated. One of the delivery drivers asked Grace last week what time I usually leave. Grace thought it was flirting. Tae-hyun didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something careful and low. Don't take the same route home twice in a row. Don't tell anyone outside this house your schedule. And Zariah, if you see that car again, you tell me immediately. Not Tae-hyun, me. You're scaring me. Good, he said. You should be a little scared. It might keep you alive. She didn't tell Tae-hyun. Not yet. She told herself it was because she didn't want to undo months of progress over something that might be nothing. She knew, underneath that reasoning, it wasn't nothing. A week later, the car came back, closer this time, parked directly outside her apartment building, instead of somewhere she could pretend was coincidental. She was halfway to her front door, keys already out, when she noticed the passenger window roll down 2 inches. A man inside studied her for 3 full seconds, unhurried, like a man confirming an order had been filled correctly. Then the window rolled back up, and the car pulled away, unhurried, into traffic. Her hands were shaking by the time she got her door locked behind her. She called Tae-hyun immediately, the way she'd promised. He looked at me like I was a photograph, she said, voice tight, like he already knew what I looked like, and was just checking the file matched. Stay inside tonight, Tae-hyun said. I'm sending someone to sit outside your building. Don't argue with me about it. I wasn't going to. Good instinct. A pause. Zariah, I think it's time you told him. I know. She didn't in the end. Not that week, and not the next. Every time she rehearsed the conversation in her head, it collapsed under its own weight. How do you tell a man who has spent 3 years convinced he destroys everything he loves that the woman helping him heal might be in danger because he's healing? She told herself she was protecting his progress. Some nights, staring at her ceiling, she suspected she was really just protecting herself from watching him disappear again. Months into her assignment, during a routine physical therapy session, everything cracked open at once. They were clearing out a storage closet Tae-hyun had refused to touch in 3 years. Old boxes, forgotten furniture, the debris of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Zariah pulled out a small wooden box and when she opened it, a pink hair ribbon slipped out and landed on the floor between them. Tae-hyun went completely still. Tae-hyun? He reached for it with a trembling hand, then stopped, like touching it might make the last 3 years real in a way he couldn't survive. That was hers, he whispered. Ha-hyun wore that every Sunday, she insisted. Didn't matter what outfit, the ribbon had to match, or the whole day was ruined. He picked it up. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. I killed them, he said, and his voice cracked apart on the words. I killed my little girl. Seo-jin begged me. She begged me not to go. She said she had a bad feeling, and I told her. His breath caught violently. I told her I'd protect them. I promised her. For 3 years he had refused to cry, refused to grieve, refused to speak either of their names out loud in front of another living soul. Now every wall he'd spent 3 years building collapsed in less than a minute. His whole body shook in the wheelchair, sobs tearing out of him in a way that sounded less like crying and more like something being physically removed from his chest. He reached for Zariah blindly, and she caught him, pulled him against her, held on with both arms as he broke completely against her shoulder. I told her I'd protect them, he gasped. I promised. Zariah didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She didn't rush the tears, didn't try to fix what wasn't hers to fix. She just held on. You don't have to carry them alone anymore, she whispered. For nearly 20 minutes, the most feared man in the Korean underworld cried in a nurse's arms, like a husband who had never been allowed to grieve. When the tears finally slowed, the silence that followed felt different. Lighter, like something that had been sitting on his chest for 3 years had finally, partially, lifted. This is the moment I promised you. And if it hit you the way it hit me writing it, do me a favor, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me which line got you. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need it. Now stay close, because what happens next is going to test everything he just started to rebuild. Healing, as it turns out, is rarely a straight line. For a few weeks after the breakdown, something in Tae-hyun softened permanently, or so it seemed. He ate more. He asked Zariah questions about her life in Savannah, her mother's cooking, the fiancé she'd almost married, and hadn't quite forgiven herself for losing. He said, I loved my patients more than I loved coming home, she told him one evening, staring at her tea instead of at him. Maybe he wasn't wrong. Maybe he just wasn't the right home, Tae-hyun said. It was the closest thing to flirting either of them had allowed themselves in months. Neither of them acknowledged it out loud. Then, 3 weeks after the ribbon, the anniversary of the crash arrived, a date the household staff tiptoed around every year like a landmine buried under the calendar. Tae-hyun didn't leave his room for 4 days. He refused meals. He told the staff, in a voice gone cold again, that he'd been a fool to think grief had an expiration date. When Zariah tried to check on him the second day, he snapped at her with a viciousness she hadn't heard since her first week. I don't need you managing my emotions like a project, he said. I let my guard down once. I'm not doing it again. She didn't argue. She left the tea outside his door instead, the way she always had, and said nothing when it sat there untouched the next morning. She understood, better than he did, that this wasn't a step backward, so much as the body, remembering an old wound the moment the calendar circled back to it. But understanding it didn't make it hurt less. On the 4th day, she stopped leaving the tea outside his door and knocked instead. Go away, Zariah. No. She sat down on the floor outside his door, back against the wall, the way she used to sit with the widower, who'd taught her that some people don't need fixing. They just need company that refuses to leave. I'm not managing you. I'm not going to fix this from out here. I'm just going to sit here until you're ready to open the door, or until I fall asleep against this very expensive wallpaper, whichever comes first. Silence answered her for a long moment. Why? His voice came, muffled and raw through the door. Do you keep staying? Because leaving never actually helped anyone I've cared about, she said. It just made the room quieter while they fell apart alone in it. she heard something shift on the other side of the door, the specific, quiet sound of a wheelchair rolling closer. 4 days, he said. Quieter now. Every year, on this day, I remind myself I don't deserve any of this. The garden, the tea, you. A pause. I thought if I said it enough times, it would stop being true. Did it work? No, he admitted. It never works. It just makes the 4 days longer. The door didn't open that night, but the tea, the next morning, was gone from the tray. Across the ocean, in an office with a view of a city Kang Tae-hyun no longer set foot in, Choi Byung-hun read the surveillance report twice before setting it down. Kang Tae-hyun was healing, funding trauma programs, reopening pieces of his legitimate business, laughing, according to one report, an American nurse's doing, apparently. Choi had spent 3 years treating Tae-hyun's ruin as a settled account, a war finished without the mess of finishing it personally. A broken man in a wheelchair was no threat to anyone. A healing man, rebuilding his empire and his will to live in the same breath, was an account that had quietly reopened itself. He remembered Tae-hyun from before, the version who never raised his voice in a negotiation because he never needed to, the version whose calm was more frightening than any threat another boss could make. Choi had waited 18 months for the right moment to end that version of him permanently. He hadn't expected the man to claw even a fraction of himself back from the wreckage. It offended him, in a way he didn't examine too closely. "Tell me about the nurse," he said to the man across from him. American. No connections, no leverage, except him. Choi almost smiled. "Then, she is the leverage. Sir, if we move against her directly, it draws attention we don't need. Tae-hyun still has friends in places that matter. I'm not asking you to move against her," Choi said. Patient, the way a man is patient, with an expensive tool he intends to use correctly. "I'm asking you to remind him what happens to the things he loves. There's a difference. Make sure he understands it. And if he doesn't back down, then he'll have taught me something useful," Choi said. "That there's still a man worth finishing inside that chair after all." The photograph arrived 3 days later, Zariah leaving through the estate gates, time-stamped, no note attached. None was needed. Tae-hyun understood immediately what it meant, and what it cost, and who would pay it if he didn't act. He did what he always did when something mattered too much to risk losing. He destroyed it himself, before anyone else could. "You're fired," he told her flatly, not meeting her eyes. "Effective immediately." "What? Tae-hyun, what happened? This was inappropriate from the start. I never asked you to get attached to me. You should have known better than to think this was ever going to be anything." "That's not fair, and you know it isn't. Fair has nothing to do with it." His voice was ice, deliberately, surgically cold. "You're a nurse. I'm a patient. That's all this was ever supposed to be. 3 weeks ago, you cried in my arms and told me my daughter's ribbon. That was a mistake." The word hit her like a slap. A mistake. A patient's mistake. Emotional dependency on a caregiver isn't unusual. It doesn't mean anything. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were doing something she'd never seen them do before, working very hard to look like they meant it. "I let it go too far. That's my failure, not yours. Consider this a professional courtesy. Pack your things. You don't get to do this." Her voice cracked, despite her best effort to hold it steady. "You don't get to hand me the last 4 months back, like a returned package, and call it a mistake. I watched you become a person again. I was there for every single piece of it. And now I'm telling you it's over." "Why?" She stepped closer, refusing to let him win the distance. "Look at me and tell me why, actually, and I'll walk out that door myself. But I'm not leaving because you threw a tantrum, convincing enough to fool a stranger. I know you too well for that now." Something flickered behind his eyes. Panic, maybe, or grief wearing panic's clothes, and for half a second, she thought he might actually tell her the truth. Then the door closed again, deliberately, the way it had 100 times before she'd learned how to pick the lock. "Pack your things," he said again, quieter this time, which somehow hurt worse than the shouting would have. Zariah stood there a long moment, searching his face for the man who'd cried in her arms 3 weeks earlier, and finding nothing but a locked door where he used to be. "Fine," she said, quiet and shaking. "I hope whatever this is, whatever's actually going on here, was worth it." She left that night without a single "I'll see you tomorrow." She sat on the edge of her bed in the small apartment she'd barely lived in, staring at a half-packed bag, and let herself hear her ex's voice again for the first time in months. "You love your patients more than you love coming home." Maybe he'd been right after all. Maybe this was just the same mistake wearing a different face, a different man, a different house, the same ending. She called her mother because some habits from Savannah never left, no matter how far a person moved. "You sound like you're about to do something foolish," her mother said. "No hello," the way she always answered when she could hear trouble in her daughter's voice. "I might be. Is he worth it?" Zariah looked at the bag, half-packed, at the ribbon-shaped hole this man had somehow carved into her chest in 4 months without either of them naming it. "I don't know if that's the right question," she said slowly. "I think the question is whether I can live with myself, if I don't at least ask him why." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Your daddy used to say the same thing about staying with sick patients nobody else wanted." Said walking away from someone at their worst was the one thing he refused to let himself get good at. A pause, softer now. "You come by it honest, baby. Just don't let it get you killed." "I'll be careful. You'll be stubborn. That's not the same thing, but it's what you've got, so use it wisely." A knock interrupted the call. Madame Han stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable in a way Zariah had never seen on her before. "I have to go," Zariah told her mother. "I love you. Love you too. Call me when you're not about to do something foolish." "He didn't fire you because he stopped caring," Madame Han said without preamble, the moment the phone was down. "He fired you because he finally started." "What are you talking about?" Madame Han told her everything. The crash that wasn't an accident, the syndicate that had never stopped watching, the photograph that had arrived 3 days ago with no note attached because none was needed. "He is trying to save your life, the only way he knows how," Madame Han said, "by making you hate him enough to run." Zariah sat very still, the half-packed bag forgotten beside her. "I loved his wife," Madame Han continued, quieter now. "I held his daughter the week she was born. I was afraid of what would happen to this house if it hoped again and lost. That is why I gave you 30 days, instead of welcoming you the way I should have." A pause. "I was wrong to be afraid of you. I was right to be afraid of what is coming for him." Zariah didn't answer right away. She thought about the widower she'd stayed with, past the point any agency would have reassigned her. She thought about the fiancé who left. She thought about every reason she had to close that bag, finish packing, and let this be someone else's tragedy to survive. Then she thought about a man who threw a vase at her head on day 1 and apologized with tea 3 weeks later. A man who let her win a wheelchair race so badly he could barely hide the smile. A man who had finally, after 3 years, said his daughter's name out loud. To her, and only her. "Where's he now?" she asked. "In his study, alone, the way he prefers to be when he's decided to die slowly instead of quickly." Zariah stood up, grabbed her keys, and left the bag exactly where it was. She's about to walk straight back into danger for a man who just tried to push her out of his life to save hers, and what happens in the next few minutes decides everything. If this story has you holding your breath right now, that's exactly where I want you. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and let's finish this together. The gate guard barely had time to react before Zariah's car screeched to a stop at the front entrance. She was out and moving before the engine fully cut. Past a startled Dao-sik, straight through the front doors of a house that had spent 3 years learning how to survive silence. She found Tae-hyun exactly where Madame Han said she would, alone in his study, staring at a photograph of his wife and daughter he'd finally allowed back on his desk, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. You need to leave, he said, without turning around. It isn't safe for you here. I know about Choi. His shoulders went rigid. I know about the photograph. I know you fired me to save my life, instead of telling me the truth, like I actually deserved. He turned, finally, and the look on his face wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief. You should hate me for how I did that. I do, a little. She stepped closer, refusing to let the distance between them win. But I hate the idea of you facing this alone even more. You promised her you'd protect the people you loved. You don't get to keep that promise by pushing away the next person who happens to love you back. The word landed between them, and neither of them moved to take it back. If Choi comes for you, Tae-hyun said, voice raw. If anything happens to you because you refused to leave when I gave you every reason to, then we'll deal with it, together, like people who actually give a damn about each other, instead of people performing distance to feel safe. She held his gaze. You've spent 3 years punishing yourself for surviving something you couldn't control. Don't punish both of us for something you can. He stared at her for a long moment. 3 years of guilt and grief, and something that had been quietly becoming love, all colliding behind his eyes. I don't know how to be that man again, he admitted, the one who could protect anyone. Then let's find out together, she said, starting now. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Kang Tae-hyun picked up a phone he'd promised himself he'd never use again. Dae-sik answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting 3 years for exactly this call. I need everything we have on Choi's current operation, Tae-hyun said. Not for revenge, for protection. There's a difference, and I intend to remember it this time. I never stopped keeping tabs, Dae-sik admitted. I was hoping you'd ask eventually. Over the following 2 days, the old machine that had once made Kang Tae-hyun one of the most formidable men in the underworld creaked back to life. Not for bloodshed, but for precision. Financial records. Shipping manifests. 3 separate deals Choi had structured through shell companies to hide exactly the kind of exposure that could end him with one phone call to the right regulator. On the first night, the black sedan came back, not to watch this time, but to test the perimeter. Dae-sik's men caught 2 figures near the estate's rear fence line just after 2 a.m., cutting through security wire with the casual efficiency of people who'd done it before. They fled the moment motion lights snapped on, but not before Dae-sik radioed Tae-hyun with 4 words that turned the study cold. They're testing our response. Zariah, sitting across from him with a mug of tea gone cold in her hands, watched him process the words without a single flicker of the old self-destruction. No shutting down, no pushing her away, just a jaw that tightened with purpose instead of guilt. Move her to the interior wing, he told Dae-sik. Double the gate detail, and send Choi the first file tonight. I want him to understand exactly how badly this ends for him if he tests that fence line again. You're sure? I've spent 3 years being sure of nothing, Tae-hyun said. I'm sure of this. Tae-hyun didn't send soldiers after that. He sent information. Enough to make Choi understand, in the space of a single afternoon, that the man he'd tried to intimidate into silence still had teeth sharp enough to end him without ever leaving his own house. The message that came back 3 hours later was short. Understood, standing down. Tae-hyun read it twice, then set the phone down on the desk, like it weighed considerably more than it should have. It's over, he told Zariah, who'd been sitting across from him through the entire 2-day standoff, refusing every suggestion that she go somewhere safer. You didn't have to become who you used to be to win, she said quietly. You just had to remember you were still capable of protecting someone. I didn't do it for revenge, he said, almost like he needed to hear himself say it out loud. I did it because I finally had someone worth fighting for, instead of someone worth mourning. This is the turning point of the whole story. The moment a broken man chose to fight instead of disappear. If you've made it this far, I promise the ending is worth every second. Drop a comment telling me what you think happens next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what we post after this. And let's watch him finally come home to himself. The months that followed weren't a straight line either, but they were, for the first time in 3 years, a line pointed forward instead of down. Tae-hyun resumed physical therapy, not because he believed it would erase what happened, but because he'd started believing, quietly and without fanfare, that his future still mattered enough to fight for. He began eating meals with his household staff, instead of alone in his room, and one evening even let Madam Han win an argument about seasoning, which the entire kitchen staff treated as a historic event. He reopened the legitimate arm of his business empire and spent considerable effort, and no small amount of money, dismantling what remained of its violent underside for good. He funneled a portion of the estate's fortune into trauma rehabilitation programs across the West Coast, quietly, without his name attached, in memory of 2 people who would never know how much good came from the worst day of his life. His return to the boardroom, 3 months after the standoff with Choi, was not universally welcomed. Several of his father's old advisors, men who had quietly assumed control of the company's direction during his absence, had grown comfortable running things without a wheelchair-bound ghost second-guessing their decisions. "With respect," one of them said, barely bothering to disguise the condescension, "the board has managed adequately without your involvement these past 3 years. Perhaps it would be wiser to focus your energy on your recovery and leave the company's direction to those who've kept it stable." Tae-hyun let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable, an old instinct resurfacing, the one that had once made rival bosses recalculate their next sentence. "Stable," he repeated. "Is that what we're calling the 11% drop in the Western Logistics division? Or the 2 contracts you let lapse to a competitor because nobody in this room wanted to make an unpopular call while I wasn't here to make it for you?" Nobody answered. "I appreciate the 3 years you spent keeping the lights on," he continued, steadier now. "I do, but I'm not asking your permission to come back. I'm informing you that I have. You can choose to work with the man in this chair, or you can find a company that isn't run by him. Those are the only 2 options on the table today." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one from 3 years earlier. Not the silence of a room afraid of him, but the silence of a room recognizing, cautiously, that the man who used to run it had actually come back. Madam Han found Zariah in the kitchen one afternoon, the way she had that first difficult night, except this time there was no countdown behind her eyes. "I owe you an apology," Madam Han said, setting down 2 cups of tea without being asked. "I spent months treating you like a threat to this house. You turned out to be the reason it still has a heartbeat. You were trying to protect him. I understood that, even when it stung. I was trying to protect myself," Madam Han corrected, quiet and honest, in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "I couldn't survive loving this family and losing it a second time. It was easier to be afraid of you than to hope again." She slid one of the cups across the table. "I don't do that anymore. Hope, I mean. I've decided to risk it." Zariah smiled and picked up the cup. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." "I know," Madam Han said. "That's precisely why I finally stopped counting the days." Daysik, for his part, returned to the estate, not as a bodyguard, but as something closer to family. A fixture at Sunday dinners, the only person allowed to tease Tae-hyun about his pancake flipping technique without consequence, since he'd apparently been the one who taught him in the first place, badly. "You taught him wrong on purpose," Zariah accused one Sunday, watching Tae-hyun burn a pancake with impressive consistency. "I taught him exactly right," Dae-sik said solemnly. "Some legacies aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to be repeated badly, on purpose, for 20 years, by people who love you anyway." Tae-hyun, flipping the ruined pancake with theatrical confidence, didn't dispute it. One evening, months later, Zariah found him in the garden his wife had designed, watching the sun go down over hedges that had finally started to feel less like a memorial and more like a home again. "I used to think," he said, without looking away from the horizon, "that if I ever smiled again, It would mean I'd forgotten them. She sat beside him. And now? A gentle, unguarded smile touched his face. The first one she'd ever seen him allow himself fully, without catching it halfway through. Now I think they'd be disappointed in me if I never smiled again. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't the wheelchair disappearing, or the guilt vanishing overnight, or grief packing its bags and leaving quietly through the front door. It was something better, something more honest, a man choosing, deliberately and daily, to live instead of merely survive. Months later, he visited his wife and daughter's graves for the first time in 3 years, Zariah beside him the entire way. He knelt as best he could beside the twin headstones, one hand resting on the cold granite of his daughter's name, and for a long while he simply breathed. "I used to come here in my head every night," he said, voice steady in a way it hadn't been in years. "Never in person. I couldn't. I thought if I stood here and said I was sorry, it would mean admitting I was still alive, to say it." He traced Hakun's name with 2 fingers. "I'm not sorry anymore. Not for surviving. I'm just sorry it took me 3 years to thank you for the time I did have." He set the pink ribbon, cleaned and pressed flat, gently against the base of the headstone. "I promised your mother I'd protect you both," he said. "I couldn't keep that promise the way I meant it, but I can keep a different one now. I can live in a way that makes you both proud instead of a way that punishes me for surviving you. That's the only promise I have left to give. I intend to keep it." Zariah stood a step behind him, giving him the space grief required and the presence it also required, both at once. The exact balance she'd spent 4 months teaching him was possible. Madame Han stood a respectful distance away, watching a man she'd once feared could never be saved stand in the sunlight instead of hiding from it. When he reached for Zariah's hand as they turned to leave, Madame Han said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence had finally become something closer to a blessing than a warning. He reached for Zariah's hand, not because she had rescued him, but because she had patiently, stubbornly, refused to leave until he found his own way back to the man his family had loved. And this time, when danger came for what he loved most, he chose to protect it instead of destroying it first. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, that's exactly why we make these, and there's more waiting for you. Subscribe, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments which moment broke you the most. We'll see you in the next one.